So hello and welcome everyone to this new episode of our little audio recordings. I hope you're all doing well and your practice goes forward smoothly and you're enjoying it. Now today I'm going to talk a little bit about a topic that is quite central, very, very important actually. It's the topic of the self-cherishing attitude. Now, the self-cherishing attitude is, we could say, kind of at the root of the various movements of the mind. It's an attitude that cherishes oneself. That's quite simply put. That's what it is. So cherishing yourself means cherishing this sense of me and mine, which is at the center of all the mental activities. I say it's at the center of all the mental activities because it's the first thing that pops up in the mind. It's this sense of I, the sense of self, and then along with it comes the various likes and dislikes, the preferences of that self, the thoughts that revolve around that self, the ideologies, the belief systems, all the various moods and emotions that also revolve around this self. It all comes around our sense of self. And it wouldn't make any sense if it wasn't for a self that these things could relate to. It wouldn't make any sense for us to suffer if there wasn't a suffering self or a sufferer. So for example, let's say you have an emotion of anxiety arising. That emotion, first of all, arises only due to the presence of a self. But think of the emotion being there without such a self that it could relate to. Then it's just an emotion. Then it's just anxiety. It's not my anxiety. It's not I am anxious. It would then just be anxiety. If it would still be there, of course, without a self. But it arises in dependency on that self. You might, for example, have anxiety arise in your mind. And then in the course of that anxiety arising, mindfulness and clear seeing kicks in, and you see clearly that there is no such thing as a self which that anxiety kind of dances with. But there is only the anxiety. In actual fact, there is this kind of emotion in your mind. Let's not even call it anxiety. Let's call it a bunch of feelings. Just feelings. Movements of energy that move through the body. That might be a bit unpleasant. Not just a movement in the body. Now you're there with this movement in the body, and suddenly you realize that there is no me that is there with this movement of feelings. But within awareness, within the mind right now, there is just that. There's just feelings moving around. Then as soon as you realize that, what happens to the anxiety? It abates, it goes away, it fades, dissolves. It has to, because its foundation has been pulled away from underneath its feet. It has no ground to stand on. The ground that it stands on is your sense of self, me and mine. There's a sense of threat when you're feeling anxious. There's something threatening me, right? And so all these various forms of suffering that we are experiencing in our daily life are always based on a sense of self. A somebody that experiences that suffering, a somebody that exists in relation to that suffering. And as a somebody that exists in relation to such suffering, I relate to that suffering mostly in two very distinct ways. One, I dislike it, I want to push it away. Or two, I like it, I want it to stay. Now that might sound a little bit weird. You might think, wait a second, how would I want suffering to stay? Very often we want things to stay which lead to suffering at a later stage, right? So what appears as pleasure at first very often or always turns into suffering later on. Things change. So a very simple example would be, as I always bring it up, I'm so sorry, but it's one of my favorite examples. I really love it. It's the physical posture, right? You change your posture because the change of the posture appears attractive. It is something that you want. But it is that very change which leads directly into the next kind of suffering. But you don't know that before you change your posture. Because you're really attracted to that change, you think it will remove the suffering which is presently there. You think if I move, then I get out of that suffering. But you don't even realize that with your movement, you're not getting out of suffering, you just get into a different kind of suffering. And it is only the moment where the old suffering ends that you perceive as being pleasant. So that's quite something to wrap your head around, but just bear with me here. You can analyze it for yourself, actually. I think rather than just believing me or, assuming that kind of viewpoint, put it to the test. I mean, sit yourself down and just remain quiet. Don't move your body. As some of you are already doing that in the course of practicing meditation. They also practice to keep the body still. So now, all of those of you who are doing that, you already know the body becomes painful after a while. And when the body becomes painful, with the pain together, your need for movement or your wanting to move grows. It becomes, until it gets to the point where it's unbearable, you really want to shift your posture. So you do that. Once you shifted your posture, you experience a short amount of pleasure. It feels nice. It's a relief. That feels nice. So it gives you a little bit of happiness. But in reality, it is just the next suffering at its beginning stage. It's not fully developed yet. So as you wait in the new posture, of course, then gradually the new suffering will reveal itself. And it's like this with everything in life. It's with every mental movement, every inner, every outer event, whatever is happening in your life, it's all following exactly that same rule. There's nothing which is statically good, always and always. You can't find anything like this in the world. There's no perfect condition that you can somehow create that then stays forever in this beautiful state. There's no such thing. That's because everything behaves according to this simple rule of change. Thus, we could really say that everything is suffering. And some of those sufferings, they haven't revealed their true face just yet. All you need to do is stay and wait and look, observe. Now, some people think that that's a quite depressive worldview. It's not very nice to think like that. And we'd rather avoid such kind of thoughts. We'd rather kind of concentrate on the various pleasures that are yet to be found, that are existing somewhere in the future, kind of like the carrot that's dangling in front of the donkey's face. And the donkey is chasing that carrot perpetually, pulling this heavy cart behind him of his past, never really reaching the carrot. So we'd rather focus on the carrot, which feels more pleasant, at least it gives us some hope, rather than focusing on the fact that we're pulling this heavy cart constantly. And I think that's one of the real moments of a beginning of a true, honest spiritual path. It's when you realize that even though you're perpetually pursuing happiness, you're never reaching it, and the world can never give that carrot to you. You have to change your strategy if you really want happiness, true happiness, reliable happiness. You have to change the strategy. And with the moment of changing your strategy, you move opposed to the mainstream. You move in opposition to the way almost everybody in this world will move mentally and physically. That's the beginning of spiritual search. It's this true turning within. You stop chasing and following and running after and hoping and fearing. You don't buy into that scheme anymore. Instead, you start asking really important questions. What is true happiness? Is such a thing really possible? And that arises mostly with a certain type of dissatisfaction. You're disappointed in the way the world moves. You feel it's going round and round. It's the same over and over again. Sometimes people suffering on this continent, then they suffer on that. Sometimes there's war over here, then it's over there. And yes, there are beautiful moments. I'm not saying that there is no beauty in this world. There is indeed a lot of beauty as well. But in order to find what is reliably and truly beautiful, not which is just changing, but which is permanently, lastingly beautiful, you have to turn within. This is something you can only find within yourself. And in order to find that, you have to let go of everything that is not true. You have to abandon the false, so to say. So this is the path within. This is the you could say this is the right path. You're abandoning what is not true gradually. And in order to do that, you have to look within. And one of the first things that you really see, if you are somehow observant and you're looking into the mind and you study its movements, then you will notice it's all about me. In fact, the more you suffer, the more fears and hopes and worries you have, the more me you will find. The less me we will find in the mind, as it's the case sometimes for people with truly altruistic motives, or when we broaden our mind a little bit and we see the bigger picture of things, that it's not just me in the world, but there's also others. When our mind broadens a little bit, also suffering becomes a bit less pronounced. But the more we withdraw into this sense of self, me, and constantly thinking of me, the more likely we are depressed, anxious, angry, worried, etc. All that. That arises in direct dependence upon a sense of self. The more heavy the sense of self, the more heavy your suffering. And the opposite happens, of course, in meditation. The more you let go of all the various movements of the mind, and the mind becomes more and more refined, the more happy you feel, the better you feel. And that feeling is based less and less on a sense of self. So as this sense of self is thinning out, you feel better and better. We could describe it like that, I would say. That's I would say, an accurate description. The less sense of self exists in the mind, and the various things which are turning around that sense of self, the happier, the more spacious, the more clear your mind becomes. It's almost like relieving the mind of a burden, letting it become more pure, more clear, more open. So that gradual diminishing of me and mine is causal for happiness to arise. Or it kind of reveals happiness. It doesn't make happiness, it doesn't fabricate it, but it reveals a happiness which is underneath it, which is deeper, which is existing when all the noise, all the BS in our minds falls away. So it's crucial to observe well, to know yourself well, which is difficult in these times because a lot of people are so confused and so easily persuaded by various advertisings, various kinds of information that come to them. We depend so heavily on books and movies and teachers and guides and authorities to tell us who we are and what we should do and who we should become and where we should move. That the mind is so used to that it's really difficult to turn that mind around and look at itself and see what's really true in this moment. To see a feeling just for a feeling, to see what it really is. It's a feeling. To see it beyond labeling, beyond conditioning it in any way, beyond pushing against it, beyond trying to hold on to it, just seeing it for what it is. It's quite difficult. We want confirmation. Is my seeing correct? What does the teacher say? We want to know, it's kind of like an absence of trust. We're not trusting our ability to know ourselves. And that's so detrimental to most of us. That's such a big problem, I would say. So we're not trusting ourselves. We're not trusting our ability to see directly here and now what is happening, what is true in my mind. I'm not saying, how should I call it? How is this feeling called? I need to ask the authorities to find out how to call that feeling. No, just see it for what it is. The same with thinking. Can you see it for what it is? It is thinking. It's not very difficult, actually, to figure that one out. It's thinking. Can you see it for what it is? Thinking comes, thinking goes. That's what thinking does. That's already it. The only thing you needed to do is just stay persistent with it. Just keep looking. And more your eyes will open. You'll see more and more. Wow, that's how the mind works. And it all centers around this self-cherishing attitude. This thinking myself to be the most important thing. The priority in the mind is me. For some people, that might be a hard pill to swallow. You might think, no, I'm very altruistic. I'm mostly thinking of other people. And like, if you're honest, you probably think of other people in relation to yourself, right? What do other people think of me? Are other people grateful because I'm helping them? Or they're not grateful? How do other people perceive me? Do they think I'm well-educated? Do they think I'm, I'm stupid? Do they think that I've messed this one up? Do they like me? Do they love me? Do I fit in? How do all those other people look at me? If you're really honest, you will find these kind of deeper motives in your thinking. You're not just thinking of other people and how they're doing and if they're well and if they're all happy, and there's always some self-interest in it. And it's almost, I perceive that for myself. I perceive that almost as if it's like a disgusting treat. And I perceive that for myself almost like a kind of a disgusting feature of the mind. I'm somewhat disgusted with that fact that no matter what I think about, it's all about me, even if it's about other people. The more I become sensitive to that, the more aware I become of that, and the more I see that with the absence of that, I feel really good and I'm at ease and I'm happy and well and clear, the more I would like to let that go. That's quite a natural process. But first of all, we have to be honest enough to face the various features in the mind that are acting as an obstacle to your happiness. As long as you're denying them, as long as you're kind of thinking of yourself in very high terms and think of yourself as being a very good person with a lot of positive thoughts and a lot of this and a lot of that, you haven't looked deep enough yet. You haven't yet seen this all-pervading sense of me and mine. And this constant interest in keeping this sense of me and mine happy and shielding it from all discomfort and suffering. Once you come to that level where you see that more and more clearly, then you're working right at the central point of suffering. And we can see that more and more clearly as our mind becomes more still. Of course, if your mind is still full of all the daily noise from your work, from your family life, from your various activities, you will not have the chance to see clearly enough. But if you're already practicing meditation to an extent every day, and your mind has calmed down a bit, then you will start to see that more clearly. You have little gaps between your thoughts, so you can analyze more clearly. Where does that thought come from? Where does it go? What moves my thoughts? What is it that moves the waves of the emotions? You can't see that if you're drowning in those waves. You can't see it properly if you're kind of blown around like dust in the wind. You have to be still to see clearly. That's why we practice meditation, to still the mind so we can see all these coarse and subtle aspects in the mind that keep us from being happy, that keep us from enjoying our being. So we gradually let them go, and as we let them go, we can see more and more clearly what's been fueling them, what's behind those things. And that's not a philosophy. That's not some sort of belief system. That is something that each and every one in this world who has a mind can see clearly. It's directly at the base mechanics of the mind, the self-cherishing attitude. Me and mine above all else. Now think of that. Every single being in this world, I add an almost every single being in this world suffers from that. And most people would defend that. They would, go to war to protect it. They would fight for it. They would argument against these functions that I'm presenting here. They would say, no, that's not true. I'm not. It's not all the self-cherishing attitude that's at the root of everything. We're not that rotten. We're not that bad. It's not about being bad. It's about simple mechanics, isn't it? You can see this and that stands in the way of happiness. And you will only see that with the falling away of the obstacle. If the self-cherishing attitude becomes less, wow, suddenly you feel much better. That's how you can understand it. It's not that you understand it through philosophizing about it or thinking about it or developing views about it. It's through practice that you start to see, that your eyes are opening up gradually. You can't have the eyes to see if your mind is still totally lost in the daily noise. So cultivate the mind well and develop it so you can see deeper and deeper levels of, or more and more refined levels of suffering, and you can let go of those levels of suffering, layers of suffering. So I hope that this kind of clarified a little bit more about the self-cherishing attitude and how that is in the way of ourselves experiencing more fulfillment or happiness or joy, bliss. And I hope that you sit down and you analyze and actually experiment a little bit with these things that I'm talking about. Maybe have a look at your daily thoughts and see what are they about. And you will find out, it's kind of a bit of a shock for most people at first. They'll find out it's all about me and mine constantly. So you can deduct from that. Since it's all about me and mine, might this me and mine itself be the very problem that I have? I hope that was useful and gave you some insights and helps with your practice. So for now, I will end the session here. If you do have any questions or comments, feel free to write them to me. Always open to discuss your questions and make these sessions a bit more personal for you. Yeah, good. So I'm wishing all of you a wonderful weekend and a nice practice. Hear you next time. Bye-bye.